The sound came before anything else. That was how Jed Calloway would remember it years later when someone asked him how it all began. Not the image of the town baking under a white sky, not the smell of dust and dry wood and something faintly like burned grain that never quite left the air in dustfall. Just the sound, a low rolling thunder that had nothing to do with weather. A sound that came from the ground itself, from something alive and enormous and in tremendous pain. He had ridden into Dustfall, New Mexico on a Thursday morning in the summer of 1886 with no particular intention of staying. His horse, a steady roan gelding named Abel, had thrown a shoe 2 miles back on the canyon road and was walking tender on his right foreleg. Jed needed a farrier, a meal, and maybe a night under a real roof before moving on. He had been moving on for 11 years. He was good at it. Dustfall was the kind of town that existed because stopping was easier than going back. A general store, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple that leaned slightly east as if it had been listening to something out in the desert for too long. A row of adobe buildings painted the color of old bone. Maybe 200 people if you counted generously, and most of them had learned not to look up when a stranger rode in. Strangers came and strangers left, and the town remained, which was the only thing that mattered. Jed led Abel slowly down the main street, one hand on the reins, the other resting easy on his thigh. He was 34 years old and looked it in the jaw and the eyes, though his hands looked older, cross-hatched with the kind of lines that come from rope and weather and years of work that does not care what season it is. He wore a gray hat that had been dark blue once, and a canvas coat that had seen better decades. He carried a rifle in the scabbard and a short blade on his belt, not because he was looking for trouble, but because the land between towns was not always friendly, and a man alone learns to be prepared without being dramatic about it. He heard the bull before he saw it. The sound was coming from the far end of the street past the livery, where a wooden corral had been built against the side of a low hill. Even from a distance Jed could see the fence shaking. He could see 3 men backing away from the gate with their hands up, not in surrender, but in that particular posture of people who have just understood that they are not in control of the situation and are trying to appear calm while their legs prepare to run. One of them was already bleeding from a gash above his elbow. Another had lost his hat somewhere and seemed upset about it in a distant, disconnected way, the way people focus on small things when the large thing is too frightening to look at directly. The bull was black, not dark brown, not very dark reddish, but black in the way that a starless night is black, a depth of color that seemed to pull light in rather than reflect it. He was enormous, easily the largest animal Jed had seen outside of a cattle drive up in Montana 4 years back, and he moved the way very large, very powerful things move when they are beyond caring about consequences. The fence was holding, but only barely. The posts were shaking with each impact. Dust rose in small explosions around the animal's hooves. Jed stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the street 20 yards from the corral, and he watched. This was something his mother had taught him before he was old enough to understand why it mattered. Before you do anything, she used to say, watch. Really watch. Not with your plans already made in your head, not with the solution already chosen in the watching, just a formality before you do what you were going to do anyway. Watch without a plan. Watch like you have never seen anything like this before because you haven't. Every living thing is different from every other living thing, and if you pretend otherwise, you will always be surprised at the worst possible moment. May Calloway had said this to her son in a kitchen in West Texas when he was 9 years old, while they watched a frightened colt pacing the fence line outside. She had said many things like it. She had a gift for finding the true nature of things, for stripping away what something appeared to be, and seeing what it actually was. She had died of fever when Jed was 16, and his father had burned her books the following week because he said a woman who filled her son's head with that kind of softness was doing the boy no favors in a hard world. Jed had left home the year after that and had not gone back. Now he stood in the street in Dustfall and watched the bull and tried to understand what he was seeing beneath the obvious thing, which was chaos and danger and a lot of frightened people keeping their distance. The bull was not, as far as Jed could determine, attacking anyone. He was moving in a pattern, not randomly. He would charge the fence in one direction, wheel around, charge again, in another stop, lower his head, breathe in ragged, heavy pulls that you could hear even from 20 yards away. His eyes were open very wide. The whites showed at the edges, which in an animal that size meant something specific. It meant the world had become too large and too loud and too full of threat, and the animal's body had taken over from whatever passed for thought, flooding everything with the single imperative to move, to break free, to escape the thing that was closing in. That was not anger. That was terror. There is a difference, Jed thought. Most people cannot see it because the two things look almost exactly the same from the outside. But they require completely different responses. And if you confuse them, if you treat terror like anger and try to overpower it or match it or intimidate it into submission, you will always make it worse. Always. He became aware in a slow and peripheral way of a woman standing near the corral gate. She was not running. That was the first thing he noticed because everyone else within range was either backing away or had already gotten to a safe distance and was watching from there with the careful interest of people who are glad it is not their problem. She stood perhaps 10 feet from the gate, close enough that a broken post would have been a serious risk, and she was not moving. Her hands were at her sides. Her feet were planted. She was watching the bull with an expression that Jed could not fully read from this distance, but that he recognized in its general shape. It was the expression of someone who is holding a very great deal of feeling, very still, the way you hold a lamp in wind cupped in both hands, not because you are strong, but because you cannot afford to let it go out. She was Apache. That was clear in the cut of her face and the darkness of her hair, which was pulled back and partially braided in the way of her people, but had come loose in the heat and the commotion. She wore a cotton dress in a faded blue that the sun had worked on for a few seasons, and practical boots and a leather cord around her wrist, with something small hanging from it that Jed could not make out. She was perhaps 28, perhaps a little younger. Her jaw was set. Her eyes did not leave the bull. No one in the crowd was standing near her. People had arranged themselves around the scene in a rough half-circle at a comfortable distance, close enough to watch but far enough to feel wise about it. And there was a gap around the woman at the corral gate, a space that might have been courtesy or might have been something else, something less generous than that. Jed walked toward her. He did not walk toward her because he had decided to help. He had not decided anything yet. He walked toward her because he wanted a better view of the bull, and also, though he did not examine this thought very closely, because she was the only person at the scene who appeared to be actually seeing it rather than reacting to it. He stopped beside her. He stood quietly for a moment. The bull charged the east fence and the posts groaned and held. Then Jed said, without looking at her, "He's not angry." The woman turned her head and looked at him. It was a direct look, the kind that takes your measure without apologizing for doing so. "What?" she said. "Your bull," Jed said. "He's not angry. He's frightened. There's a difference in how they move. Angry animals are deliberate. They target. Frightened animals move like this in patterns, like they're trying to outrun something that's inside them." The woman looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the bull. "I know," she said. Jed was quiet for a beat. He had not expected that. "Then you know what not to do." "I know what not to do. What I don't know," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite bitterness, but was related to it a kind of exhausted precision, "is what to do. The men who tried to help used ropes. He's worse now than he was 3 days ago." "How long has he been like this?" She paused before answering, and in that pause Jed understood that the question had a longer answer than the simple one. 8 months, she said finally. "Since the fire." Jed nodded slowly. He did not ask about the fire. Not yet. He had learned over many years that there are questions you ask immediately and questions you earn the right to ask later, and the difference between them is something you can only feel, not explain. "What's his name?" Jed asked instead. Something shifted in the woman's face, just slightly. "Scout," she said. "My father named him." Jed looked at the bull again. Scout was standing now in the center of the corral sides, heaving head low. He was watching the gate with the absolute concentrated attention of an animal that is waiting for the next threat to materialize. His whole body was a coiled question. "He's waiting for something bad to happen," Jed said. "That's all he's doing. He's not crazy. He's just waiting." The woman did not respond to this directly. She turned and looked at Jed again with that same steady, taking stock quality. "Who are you?" she said. "Jed Calloway. My horse needs a farrier." He said this second part because he wanted her to understand that he had not ridden into Dustfall to be anyone's solution to anything. He was a man with a lame horse and no plans. "Nara Longbow," she said. She did not offer her hand, not because she was unfriendly, but because it was not her custom, and she saw no reason to perform a custom that was not hers for the benefit of a stranger. "That's my bull." "I figured." From somewhere behind them at the edge of the watching crowd, a boy's voice said, "Nara." She turned. A boy of about 14 was making his way through the loose gathering of onlookers, weaving between elbows and hats with the unconscious ease of someone who has spent his whole life being smaller than the people around him and has learned to navigate accordingly. He had Nara's same dark coloring and something of her same directness in the way he moved. When he reached her, he was slightly out of breath, and his expression was the specific expression of someone who has bad news and is trying to decide how to give it. "Roy Halston sent a man," the boy said. He looked briefly at Jed, a quick and assessing look that Jed recognized as the look of a boy who has learned too early to be careful about who his family trusts. "Said they'll be coming to survey the east boundary next week." Nara's jaw tightened. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "All right." "All right," the boy said. "That's all." "What would you like me to say, Pip?" The boy, Pip, pressed his mouth together and looked at Scout, who had begun his pacing again, that tight, contained circuit that used up energy without going anywhere. Then he looked at Jed again, longer this time, with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite hope, and was probably some combination of both. Jed became aware at the edge of his vision of a rider at the far end of the street. A heavy man on a gray horse sitting still watching the scene at the corral, the way a man watches something he has already calculated the value of. He had the particular stillness of someone who is not surprised by anything he sees, which is either the stillness of wisdom or the stillness of a man who has arranged things to turn out the way they are turning out. After a moment, the rider turned his horse and moved slowly away, unhurried like a man with nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Jed looked back at Scout. "I'd like to sit with him," Jed said, "if you'll allow it." Nara looked at him. "Sit with him." "Outside the fence. Just sit. Not do anything. Just be there." She studied him for a long moment. In that moment Jed felt the full weight of her assessment, and he did not try to influence it. He just stood where he was and let her look. "You'll get yourself killed," she said finally. It was not a warning exactly. It was more like information delivered without emotion. "I'll be outside the fence," Jed said. "I'm not planning on getting killed today." Nara looked at Scout, then back at Jed. Something moved through her expression and was gone before he could name it. "All right," she said. "Sit." Jed lowered himself to the ground, cross-legged in the dust, his back straight, his hands resting open on his knees. He positioned himself so that he was visible to Scout through the fence rails, but not directly in front of the gate, not in a place that could read as a threat or a challenge. He kept his breathing slow and even. He looked at the ground in front of him rather than at the bull, because direct sustained eye contact is a challenge in the language of large prey animals, and Jed knew this the way he knew which plants held water in the desert and which direction rivers ran. Scout stopped pacing. He turned and looked at the man sitting in the dust. He did not charge. He did not look away. He just looked. Jed sat. After a long time, Nara said quietly from where she stood a few feet behind him, "What are you doing?" "Letting him look at me," Jed said without turning around. "He needs to know I'm not going to do anything sudden." "That could take a long time." "Yes," Jed said. "It could." The sun moved across the sky above them, and the dust settled, and Scout stood on his side of the fence, looking at the man sitting in the dirt, and Jed sat on his side looking at the ground, and neither of them moved. He came back the next morning before the town was fully awake. He had found a room above the livery, a small space with a cot and a window that faced east and let in the light at a useful angle in the early hours. The farrier had looked at Abel's hoof and said 2 days, maybe 3, and Jed had paid for the room and the farrier's time, and had sat on the cot that first night thinking about a black bull standing at the center of a corral in the dark, waiting for the next bad thing. The second morning he arrived at the corral when the sky was still more gray than blue, and the air had that brief, fragile coolness that the desert allows before it takes it away again. He had a bucket of clean water and some good hay, and he set them near the fence where Scout could reach them when he chose to, and then he sat down in his spot from the previous day and was quiet. Scout was already awake. Jed was not surprised. Frightened things do not sleep deeply. They rest in the shallows of sleep and rise at the first sound or shift of air or change in the quality of darkness. The bull was standing at the far end of the corral watching the gate, and when Jed settled into his place, the animal turned and looked at him with that same long, total attention as before. Good, Jed thought. He remembers me. That matters. He heard her before he saw her. Not footsteps exactly, but the particular quality of silence that changes when a person enters it, the way a room feels different when someone walks in even before they speak. Nara appeared at the edge of his vision and sat down, not beside him exactly, but near him, perhaps a meter to his left, her knees drawn up, her hands loose around them. She did not say good morning. Jed did not say it either. They sat together in the cooling dark and watched the bull. After a long time, Jed said, "Has he always been Scout?" "Since he was a calf," Nara said. "My father said he was always the one who wandered farthest and always the one who found his way back. Even as a very young calf he would go to the edge of the field and stand there looking out like he was learning the land, and then he would always come home." Jed was quiet, letting this sit. "Your father raised him," he said. It was not a question. "From birth," Nara said, "he had a way with animals. Patience. He never rushed anything." She paused. "Scout would follow him around the yard like a dog." Jed nodded slowly. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes toward the bull, but he was listening the way his mother had taught him to listen, not waiting for the next moment to speak, but actually taking in what was being given. Scout had moved. Not much. 3 steps closer to the fence. He had stopped again and was looking at the bucket of water with an interest he was trying to appear not to have the way animals do when they want something, but are not yet sure that wanting it is safe. "Your father," Jed said quietly. "He was in the fire." The air changed. He felt it without looking at her, a drawing and a stiffening that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but contained elements of both. "He went into the burning barn," Nara said. Her voice was level and dry in the way of someone who has rehearsed a thing until the telling of it no longer sounds like the feeling of it. "Scout was chained in a stall. My father went in to free him. The roof came down." Jed said nothing. He let the words be there without rushing past them. "Scout got out," Nara said. "My father didn't." A long silence. "I'm sorry," Jed said, the 2 words simply. "It was 8 months ago," she said, as though the time made it a different category of thing. "It doesn't matter how long ago it was," Jed said quietly. "Sorry is still the right word." She did not respond to this, but he felt something shift in the air between them, something that had been held at a careful distance, moving slightly cautiously closer. Scout took 2 more steps toward the water bucket. He stopped. He extended his neck very slowly, his nostrils working, reading the air above the bucket for information. Then he pulled back, not in alarm, just in consideration. He was weighing the risk. "He's thinking about it," Jed said softly. "He's been thinking about it for 20 minutes, Nara said. "That's all right," Jed said. "Let him think." She made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a response and decided against it. Then she said, "You said yesterday that you knew what it was like to be him." Jed considered this. He had said that the previous day, talking quietly to Scout through the fence rails before Nara had arrived. He had not realized she was there. He had thought he was speaking to the bull alone. Yes, he said. What did you mean? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, but finding the right part of the answer to offer, which is different from avoiding. There was a version of the story that was biographical, a sequence of facts about a man named Edmund Calloway and a farm in West Texas, and a boy who learned too young that showing care for something was considered weakness by the people who were supposed to teach him what strength was. There was another version, shorter and truer, that lived not in the facts, but in what the facts had left behind. I grew up being told that patience was a flaw, he said. That if you weren't handling something fast and hard, you weren't handling it right. My father ran cattle. He ran everything else the same way cattle, horses, people. Push hard enough and long enough and they'll go where you want. He paused. He wasn't a cruel man on purpose. He just thought that was what the world required. Scout had his nose above the water bucket now. His breath rippled the surface. My mother was different, Jed said. She understood that things go at their own speed and that trying to force them faster just changes the direction, not the pace. She used to sit with the horses when they were scared. Just sit. For hours sometimes. She sounds like my grandfather, Nara said. She died when I was 16. He said this without drama, just as information. My father burned her books the week after. He said she had been making me soft. He paused. I left the year after that. I don't know if I was running toward something or away from something. Probably both. Scout drank. They both saw it at the same moment. The bull's great head dropped to the water, and he drank in long, pulling swallows, his sides moving with it, and the sound of the water being drawn up was the only sound for a moment in the whole quiet morning. Nara made no sound. Jed glanced at her sideways and saw that her eyes were very bright, and she was looking at Scout with an expression so unguarded that he looked away immediately, because some things are private even when they happen in the open. After a while she said, "He hasn't eaten since Tuesday." "He will now," Jed said. "He's decided the bucket is safe. The bucket came from me. That means I'm provisionally safe. We can work with provisional." Nara was quiet for a moment. "That's a very small amount of progress." "Yes," Jed agreed. "It is. The men who tried before you wanted him rideable in 3 days. One of them gave him 5 days before he gave up. He was the most patient one." She paused. "How long are you planning to stay?" Jed considered the question. 2 days ago the answer would have been easy. Just until Abel's hoof heals. Just until I have a reason to move on, which I always do. But something about sitting in the dust outside a frightened bull's fence with this particular woman beside him had complicated the simplicity of that answer in a way he hadn't examined yet. "I have time," he said. Pip arrived at 7:30 with a biscuit wrapped in cloth that he gave to Nara without ceremony, and a secondary biscuit that he held on to while he stood looking at the situation with the evaluating expression that seemed to be his natural resting face. "He drank," Pip said, looking at the empty bucket. "This morning," Nara said. Pip looked at Jed. "Because of you." "Because of him," Jed said, nodding toward Scout. "He decided to. I just didn't give him a reason not to." Pip chewed on this along with his biscuit. He was a boy whose intelligence showed not in quickness, but in the way he absorbed things, turned them over, held them up to the light before deciding what to do with them. He would grow up to be the kind of man people underestimated right up until the moment they stopped. "Roy Halston is coming to church Sunday," Pip said, apparently addressing neither of them in particular and both of them at once. "I heard Sheriff Dameron talking about it. Something about the East Boundary Survey. He wants the church elder to witness it." Nara said nothing. Her jaw was the only thing that moved. "Who is Roy Halston?" Jed asked. He knew the answer was more than a name. Nara was quiet long enough that Pip looked at her, and when she still didn't speak, the boy answered in her place in the careful way of someone who has learned to present facts without editorializing, because editorializing tends to lead to arguments. "He owns the Halston Land and Loan Office on the main street. He holds a note on the land our family farms. Our father took a loan from him 3 years ago during the drought. Roy wants the land. He's always wanted it. It's on the east side of the valley where the water runs." "The debt," Jed said, "is due at the end of 6 weeks," Nara said. Her voice was flat and precise. "If we don't pay in full, the contract gives him right of first claim on the land." "How much?" Nara looked at him sidelong. It was not the look of someone who does not want to say. It was the look of someone who has been asked how much their wound hurts, which is a different kind of private. "More than we have," she said. Jed nodded. He did not offer solutions which he did not yet have, or sympathy which in that moment would not have helped. He just received the information and let it settle into the larger picture he was building of this town, this woman, and this bull, and the web of connected pressures that ran between them. He looked toward the far end of the street. No rider this morning. But the memory of that large man on the gray horse watching from a distance with the patience of someone who already knows the ending of a story stayed with him. "Tell me about the fire," Jed said. "Where it started." Nara turned to look at him fully. "Why?" "Because Scout has been frightened for 8 months," Jed said, "and I need to understand what frightened him." She studied him for a moment. Then she looked at Scout, who had moved back to the center of the corral and was standing quietly now, no longer pacing his ears at a more natural angle. The raw electric tension of the previous day had not left him entirely, but it had shifted, become something more like watchfulness than panic. "It started in the barn," she said. "In the evening. My father and I had argued that afternoon." She said this last sentence in the same flat voice as the rest of it, but Jed heard the weight underneath the specific heaviness of a detail that has been turned over many times. "I had gone inside the house. He was still in the yard. I heard him shout and then I smelled the smoke." "What did you argue about?" She looked at him. This was a question further inside the circle than he had gone before, and she was measuring whether he had earned it. "I wanted to leave," she said. "To study medicine in Santa Fe. He wanted me to stay. He didn't say it was because he needed help with the land, though that was part of it. He said a woman who left her family was a woman who had decided her own life mattered more than the people in it." She paused. "We said things, both of us. I went inside." She was quiet. "He went into the barn to free Scout when the fire started," she said. "He always thought of Scout before himself." Jed did not say that the fire was not her fault. He had lived long enough to know that saying that to someone who is blaming themselves accomplishes nothing, because they already know the logical version of that statement, and they have decided in some part of themselves that does not respond to logic that it does not apply to their particular situation. What he could do, and what he did, was sit quietly with what she had said, which is also something his mother had taught him, the difference between hearing someone and just waiting for them to finish. He looked at Scout. The bull was looking at him. "Can I ask you something?" Jed said. "You've been asking me things," Nara said. "A different kind of thing." He paused. "Scout is frightened of sudden noise, shouting specifically. I noticed it yesterday. A man across the street yelled at his dog and Scout went into the fence immediately. But when I lit a match this morning to see if fire itself was the trigger, he didn't react at all." Nara was still. "What does that mean?" "It means that whatever Scout experienced in the fire, what stayed with him was the sound of a person shouting, not flames, not heat, a voice, voices." He let her sit with this. "Your father," he said carefully, "was he the kind of man who shouted?" "Never," she said immediately, and with a certainty that was its own kind of testimony. Jed nodded. He looked at Scout. He looked at the east fence of the corral where the damage from the bull's impacts was concentrated, where the posts were most cracked and the rails most splintered, where Scout returned again and again in his worst moments. He looked at the east fence, and he thought about what it meant that a quiet man's bull had been so frightened by shouting that he had carried it in his body for 8 months. He thought about what it meant that a man who never raised his voice had somehow on the night of a fire produced the kind of sound that leaves this kind of mark. He thought about a heavy man on a gray horse watching from a distance unhurried. He did not say any of this to Nara. Not yet. He turned it over carefully in his mind and held it there, a question with no answer, that he could prove a shape in the dark that he could feel but not yet see. "All right," he said simply. Let's stay with him a while longer." They sat together in the warming morning, the woman and the man and the slowly quieting bull, and the sun moved over the canyon walls, and the shadows shortened around them, and something between the three of them, still fragile, still provisional, still needing a great deal of time and care to become what it might become, began to take its first careful shape. Scout walked to the fence and stopped. He was perhaps 4 feet from where Jed sat. He extended his head slightly. His breath moved the dust near Jed's boot. Jed did not move. He kept his hands open and his breathing even, and his eyes looking at the ground just ahead of him, and he let the bull look. After a long time, in a voice very low and not particularly directed at Nara, but not intended to exclude her either, Jed said, "Easy. I know. I know it's all still there, but it doesn't have to be all there is." The bull breathed. The morning moved around them. Nara, sitting a meter away listening, said nothing, but she did not leave. The 10th day began like the others. Jed arrived at the corral before sunrise, when the sky above the canyon walls was the color of cold ash and the stars were still visible in the west, fading slowly, the way convictions fade, not all at once, but one by one, until you look up and realize they are gone. He carried the water bucket in one hand and a portion of good grain in a cloth sack in the other, and he walked without hurrying, because he had learned over the past week and a half that Scout could hear the quality of a person's intention in the rhythm of their footsteps, the way a tuning fork hears the note it is made for. Scout was already at the fence when Jed arrived. This was new. For 9 days the bull had stood at the back of the corral each morning waiting, watching, making Jed come to him in the only way available, which was to sit close enough to be seen and far enough to be safe. But this morning Scout was at the fence when Jed rounded the corner of the livery, standing there with his great head low and his ears forward, and when Jed saw him he stopped walking and stood still for a moment just to take it in. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing at all. He set the bucket down near the fence without rushing and sat in his usual place, and Scout did not step back. The bull watched him with that dark, total attention that Jed had come to understand was not aggression, but was in fact its opposite, the concentrated watchfulness of an animal that is trying very hard to believe that something is safe and is looking for any reason to confirm that belief. Jed looked at the ground in front of him and breathed slowly and let Scout look. After a time he heard Nara. She came each morning now, and she came earlier than she had at the beginning. The first few days she had arrived an hour after Jed, as though she needed to give herself time to decide whether to come at all. Then 40 minutes, then 30. Then she had started arriving while the light was still gray and thin, and they would sit together in the cooling silence and watch Scout and sometimes talk and sometimes not, and both kinds of mourning had become, without either of them making a decision about it, a necessary part of the day. She sat down beside him, closer than she used to sit. Not close in any way that announced itself, just the natural shortening of a distance that had been maintained out of caution, and was maintained less rigidly now that the caution had been at least partially earned its way out of. She saw Scout at the fence, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Then quietly, "He was waiting for you." "He was waiting to see if I would come," Jed said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Jed thought about this. "He's been waiting every day to find out if today is the day I stop coming. Every animal that's been badly frightened does that. They keep expecting the good thing to end. They keep testing whether it's real." Nara was quiet. Then she said, "People do that too." It was not quite a confession, and not quite an observation. It landed somewhere between the two, in the space where things are said when someone is not sure they mean to say them out loud, but says them anyway. Jed looked at Scout. "Yes," he said simply. "They do." Scout lowered his head toward the water bucket and drank without hesitation. No extended negotiation, no prolonged weighing of risk. Just drank. The difference from the 3rd day, when the act of drinking had been a 20-minute deliberation, was the difference between a door that is locked and a door that is open, and Jed felt it in his chest, the way you feel the resolution of a cord that has been held in suspension too long. He glanced sideways at Nara. He caught her off guard, or rather, he caught the moment just before she reassembled her expression, the half-second in which something unguarded crossed her face. She was watching Scout drink with an expression that was grief and relief in equal measure, two things that should not be able to occupy the same face at the same moment, but sometimes do, when the thing you have been afraid of losing turns out to still be there, changed but present, damaged, but alive. She turned and found him looking at her. He did not look away. She did not either. It was one of those moments that has weight to it, a silence that is not empty but full, the way certain silences in music are not rests, but part of the composition. Then Scout tossed his head, and the moment released them both, and they looked back at the bull. "He's going to let you touch him today," Nara said. "I can tell." "Maybe," Jed said. "I won't try to force it." "I know," she said. And then, after a pause that had something thoughtful in it, "That's the thing that's different about you." Jed did not ask her to elaborate. He let it be what it was. The morning warmed around them, and they sat with Scout and talked the way they had begun to talk, in the unhurried way of people who are not trying to arrive anywhere in particular, where one thing leads naturally to the next, and the conversation finds its own shape rather than being steered toward a destination. She told him about her grandfather, an old man named Hugh Longbow, who had lived to 91 and had spent his last decade sitting outside his house in the evenings watching the light change on the hills. She said he had taught her that every living thing speaks, and that most human unhappiness comes from the fact that people spend their energy making sound rather than learning to listen. She said this with a dry precision that told Jed she had thought about it a great deal and had arrived at her own version of it separate from her grandfather's, tested by her own experience. Jed told her about the cattle drives he had worked after leaving home, the seasons in Montana, and then New Mexico, and then Arizona, and back again, always moving, always just past the edge of permanence, close enough to see what it looked like to belong somewhere, but never quite stepping inside it. "Why not?" she asked. "Why never stop somewhere?" He was quiet for a moment. The honest version of the answer required him to look at something he usually kept in his peripheral vision present, but unexamined. "Because stopping means staying," he said finally. "And staying means the place you're in can lose you, can take someone you care about." He paused. "It's easier to be the one who leaves first." Nara looked at him steadily. "Easier for who?" The question arrived quietly and sat there patient as a stone. Jed did not answer it. He looked at Scout, who had moved to stand 3 feet from where he sat, and he slowly, very slowly, lifted his hand from his knee and held it open at shoulder height, palm up, at a height where Scout could reach it if he chose to, without lowering his head in a way that felt vulnerable. Scout looked at the hand. The whole morning seemed to pause. Then the bull stretched his neck forward by degrees, slow as the movement of shadows, and put his nose into Jed's open palm. The breath from Scout's nostrils was warm and steady and smelled of grain and something deeper. The smell of the animal itself, which is the smell of living muscle and old fear and something else that Jed had no word for, but that felt in this moment like trust in its most primary form before language makes it complicated. Jed did not move. He let his hand be there, receiving, not grasping. Scout breathed into his palm. Beside him, Nara had gone very still. When he finally looked at her, she had turned her face away. Her shoulders moved once, a single controlled movement, and then she was still again. He looked back at Scout and did not say anything, because sometimes the right response to a thing that moves you is just to let it have moved you. It took her a few minutes. When she spoke, her voice was composed again, reconstructed with care. "My father used to say that Scout could read a person's heart," she said. "He said the bull always knew." "He knew mine," Jed said. "I'm not sure what he read there, but he didn't find anything that scared him." She made that small sound again, the one that was the cousin of a laugh. Then she said, "Jed, can I ask you something that is none of my business?" "You can ask," he said. "What happened before you came here? The thing you carry." She paused. "I'm not asking to pry. I'm asking because you know what I carry, and it seems fair." He considered this. He did not think about whether to answer. He had already understood without articulating it that this woman's question was not the kind that comes from curiosity, It was the kind that comes from recognition from one person seeing the shape of a weight in another person and naming it not to expose it, but to say, "I see it," which is different from saying, "I am going to fix it." "I had a horse," he said, "before Abel. Her name was Rowan. She was the best horse I ever worked with, maybe the best animal I've ever known." He paused. 4 years ago I was running freight between Albuquerque and a mining camp in the mountains. Late October. A contract that paid well enough that I pushed the schedule harder than I should have. There was a river crossing on the third day, normally easy, but we'd had heavy rain that week and the crossing was running higher than I had seen it. He stopped. "She didn't want to cross," he said. "She told me. Not in words, but the way horses tell you in the tension of her neck and the particular quality of how she was holding herself. She was frightened, and she was telling me she was frightened, and I looked at the schedule, and I looked at the crossing, and I told myself it was manageable." Nara said nothing. She listened. "She went into the river and she lost her footing on the third step," Jed said. "The current took her sideways. She broke her leg on a submerged rock. I got to shore." He paused. "She didn't." He looked at Scout. "I had to finish what she couldn't survive herself," he said. "I won't go into what that means, but you understand what it means." "Yes," Nara said softly. "I kept moving after that," he said. "And I told myself I was moving because there was always somewhere else to be. But really I was moving because when you stop and stay still long enough, the things you've done wrong catch up to you, and you have to sit with them." He paused. "She told me she was afraid and I didn't listen. That's the whole of it." The silence between them after that was the kind that does not need to be filled. It was the silence of two people who have set down something heavy in the same room and are both looking at it, and neither one is asking the other to pick it up. Scout lowered his head and pressed it gently against Jed's shoulder. It was the first time the bull had made an approach that was not about investigation. It was contact for its own sake, the kind of contact that says, "I know you are there, and I am choosing to be here." Jed put his hand up slowly and rested it against the side of Scout's jaw. He felt the bull breathe. Beside him, Nara let out a long, quiet breath that she had perhaps been holding since her father died. That afternoon, Pip came to the corral with something in his expression that was half determination and half the specific sheepishness of someone who has done something before thinking it fully through. Jed was inside the corral for the first time that day, standing in the center with Scout calm at his shoulder, the distance between them reduced to the length of a hand. Nara was at the fence watching with an expression that managed to be both proud and anxious simultaneously. Pip stopped at the gate, looked at the scene with that quiet taking stock quality and said, "I tried to go in yesterday when you weren't here." Nara turned immediately. "Pip." "He charged the fence," Pip said, not with embarrassment, but with the objectivity of someone reporting data. "Twice. Then he just stood there looking at me." He paused. "I wasn't scared. I want you to know that." "You should have been scared," Nara said. "I was a little scared," Pip admitted. "But I went back to the fence and I sat down like Jed does, and Scout looked at me for a while and then he went back to the center." He looked at Jed. "Why did it work when I sat down?" Jed moved very slowly to the fence, Scout walking beside him with the loose, unhurried movement of an animal that has decided something. "Because you stopped being a threat," Jed said. "Standing up, you're a problem. Sitting down, you're just a thing in the landscape. Scout has enough things to worry about without adding you to the list." "I wanted to help," Pip said, and there was something in the directness of it that was not an excuse but a real thing plainly stated. Jed looked at him. "Were you trying to help your sister, or were you trying to show something?" Pip was quiet for a beat, long enough that the honest answer had time to surface past the quicker one. "Both," he said finally. "All right," Jed said. "That's honest. Learn to tell those two things apart. The first one matters. The second one will get you into trouble." He paused. "Come back tomorrow morning, early. You can sit with us." Pip looked at Nara. She looked at Jed, and in her look was a question, and something underneath the question that was gratitude, though she was not the kind of person who wore gratitude on the surface. Early, Pip said. He left and Jed watched him go down the street toward their house at the edge of town. This 14-year-old boy carrying a weight that was not made for 14-year-olds, and thought that there was something in Pip that would either break under that weight or be tempered by it, and that which one it became would depend largely on whether anyone gave him the tools to carry it differently. That evening, when the light was going red and long across the canyon walls, Nara said, "Tell me about Roy Halston." It was Jed who had asked that question of her 2 weeks ago. She was asking it back, and both of them knew what that meant. Jed had been listening. He had been gathering the way you gather information about terrain before you cross it, not obsessively but with attention. He had talked to the man at the general store and to the farrier and to an old woman who sat on her porch every afternoon and watched the street with the informed interest of someone who has lived in a place long enough to know where all the fault lines are. Roy Halston came to Dustfall in 1868, Jed said. He was 37 years old, and he had nothing except the willingness to work hard and the ability to read a contract better than the men he was working with. He filed on land in the East Valley under the Homestead Act. He spent 12 years developing it. Good water, good grass. He ran cattle and did well. And then the treaty ruling came, Nara said. It was not a question. 1871. The territorial court ruled that the East Valley land fell within the boundaries of Apache land rights under the 1854 agreement. Halston's claim was vacated. He paused. He lost 12 years of work to a legal decision he had no part in making and no power to appeal. Nara looked at the horizon. Her expression was complicated in the way of someone who understands more than one side of a thing without being comfortable about it. "He's not wrong that it was his work," she said slowly. "The land was his people's land first. But he did not take it with malice. He did not know." "No," Jed said. "He probably didn't. But knowing and not knowing doesn't change the losing." "So he found another way to take it," Nara said. Flat, not angry, just the fact of it. "He found a legal way to hold it over people," Jed said, "which is different from taking it, and which is why nobody has been able to stop him." He paused. "Your father's loan. What rate did Halston charge?" Nara looked at him. 12% annually." Jed was quiet for a moment. He had known this was coming, had been turning it over since the first time he heard the number from Pip, because the number had not sat right with him. "The territorial legislature passed a law in 1880, he said carefully. "Maximum legal lending rate in New Mexico Territory, 8% annually." Nara stared at him. "The rate in your father's contract is 50% above the legal limit," Jed said. "The actual amount you owe calculated at the legal rate is substantially less than what Halston is collecting." The silence that followed was very long. "I tried to bring a complaint to the magistrate," Nara said finally. Her voice was controlled, but something moved underneath it. 18 months ago. Magistrate Orrin dismissed it without a hearing. No explanation given. "Orrin," Jed said. "He and Roy Halston are old acquaintances," Nara said. And in the word acquaintances, she placed a particular weight that communicated everything about what that relationship was and was not. Jed nodded slowly. He looked at Scout, who was standing quietly at the center of the corral in the low evening light, calm, in a way he had not been calm 8 days ago, and he thought about what it meant that the legal mechanism for protecting Nara had been blocked by the same network of obligation and interest that Halston moved through like water through familiar channels. "We need someone with authority above Orrin," Jed said. "The territorial level." "There's a circuit magistrate who comes through Dustfall twice a year," Nara said. "He was here in April. He won't be back until October." "There are other ways to reach the territorial authority," Jed said. "Letters, formal complaints. If the violation of the lending law is documented clearly enough, someone has an obligation to respond." Nara looked at him with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite hope. "You know about that?" "I worked as a court clerk for 2 years in Albuquerque," he said, "after Roan. I needed to do something that required no animals for a while." He paused. "I know how to write a complaint that someone in Santa Fe has to read." She was looking at him in a way he was not entirely prepared for, a look that was not gratitude exactly, but was the thing that comes before trust when trust is still deciding whether to commit itself. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." They sat in the warm last light of the day and talked about numbers and documents and the specific language of formal legal complaint, and Scout stood quietly in the corral nearby, and neither of them noticed that at the far end of the street Roy Halston's office light was burning late, and that through the window a large man was reading a piece of paper with the concentrated attention of someone who has just learned that the situation he thought was settled may not be as settled as he believed. Old Chuho lived at the edge of things. His house, if it could be called that, was a structure at the eastern margin of town, where the buildings gave way to open land, a low adobe with a roof that had been repaired so many times in so many different materials that it looked like a map of the years that had passed over it. He was 83 years old and had lived in the territory since before it had a name that white maps recognized, and he knew things about dustfall and the people in it, the way old growth trees know the history of the land they stand in, not in words but in rings. Nara had mentioned him in passing, the way you mention someone who is always there, constant as geography. Jed had begun to pay attention whenever his name came up, and it came up often when people talked about the time before, about the way things had been before certain decisions were made, and certain things were built, and certain people arrived. Chuho had been there for all of it. He had watched. Jed went to see him on a Tuesday morning, walking to the east edge of town with no particular claim on his time and a straightforward question he was not sure he had the right to ask. The old man was sitting outside in a chair that had been repaired as many times as the roof and in as many different materials. He was looking east at the land that rolled away from town toward the canyon country, and he did not turn when Jed approached, which meant either that he had not heard him or that he had heard him and was choosing not to perform surprise. Jed stopped a respectful distance away. "Mr. Chuho?" "I know who you are," the old man said. His voice was unexpectedly clear, not the fragile voice of very old age, but something more durable, worn smooth rather than worn out. "The man who is teaching Thomas Longbow's bull to trust again." "I'm not sure I'm teaching him anything," Jed said. "More like giving him time." Chuho turned and looked at him. His face was deeply lined in the way of people who have spent their lives in sun and wind, and his eyes were dark and quite clear. "Same thing sometimes," he said. "Sit down if you want to talk." There was no second chair. Jed sat on the ground, which the old man seemed to find appropriate. He offered no tea and no pleasantries, which Jed appreciated. "I want to ask you about the fire," Jed said. "The night Thomas Longbow died." Chuho was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who does not want to answer, but the quiet of someone choosing where to begin. "What do you already know?" the old man asked. "I know Thomas went into the barn when the fire started to free Scout. I know the roof came down before he got out. I know Scout was chained in a stall." Jed paused. "I know Scout's fear is triggered by shouting. By a specific quality of shouting, a man's voice raised in anger at close range, not by fire itself." Chuho looked at him for a long time. "You figured that out sitting outside a fence," the old man said. "It took about a week," Jed said. "I kept testing different things. The fear response is very specific, too specific for a general trauma." Chuho turned back toward the east. He was quiet long enough that Jed began to wonder whether the conversation was over before it had fully begun. Then the old man said, "Roy Halston was there that night." Jed kept his face still. He had suspected it. Suspecting a thing and hearing it confirmed are different weights. "He came to see Thomas," Chuho said, "about the loan, about the east boundary. He wanted Thomas to agree to sign over the grazing rights as additional security. Thomas refused." He paused. "I was walking back from the canyon road that evening. I saw Halston's horse outside the barn. I heard voices. Not words, just the quality of voices." "Angry," Jed said. "Halston's voice was angry," Chuho said precisely. "Thomas did not shout. He was not a man who shouted. That was not his way." He paused. "Then I heard the horse and I went on because it was their business, not mine. When I came back past the trail, the barn was burning." Jed was quiet, processing this carefully. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions because conclusions jump to prematurely have a way of hardening into convictions before the evidence is complete, and hardened convictions make poor guides. "Did you see Halston leave?" he asked. "No," Chuho said. "His horse was gone when I came back. The fire had just started. I ran to the house and pounded on the door, and Nara came out, and we both saw Thomas running into the barn." He paused. "He did not come out." "Did you tell anyone what you saw?" Jed asked carefully. "I told Magistrate Oren," Chuho said 3 days after. "I told him I had seen Halston's horse outside the barn that evening and had heard raised voices." He turned and looked at Jed with an expression that was completely without bitterness, but was not without knowledge. "Oren wrote it down. I never heard from him again about it." Jed sat with this for a while. "The fire," he said. "What started it?" "A lamp," Chuho said. "The sheriff said a lamp was overturned. In the argument, presumably. It was the official finding." He paused. "Whether it was overturned in the argument or after the argument is not something the official finding addressed." Jed looked at the old man. "You think Halston was there when it started?" "I think," Chuho said carefully, "that a frightened bull who was inside the barn during that fire has a very specific memory of a certain kind of shouting. And I think Thomas Longbow was not a man who shouted." He paused. "What you do with that is your business." Jed was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the dry grass around the old man's house, and the light was very clear and bright in the way of high-altitude mornings, the kind of light that makes things look exactly as they are with no softening. "Halston was not the cause of the fire," Jed said slowly. "Not necessarily. It could have been the argument, a knocked lamp, an accident." "Yes," Chuho agreed. "It could. But he was there," Jed said, "and he didn't help, and he didn't come forward. And Nara has been carrying the belief that her argument with her father was what caused his death." Chuho said, "Because she was inside the house, and she heard nothing, and she has had nothing to set against her own guilt for 8 months." Jed looked east the same direction. Chuho looked at the land that was the Longbow land, and that Roy Halston wanted, and had been methodically working to obtain through the leverage of a debt he had no legal right to collect at the rate he was charging. He thought about what it means to hold information that belongs to someone else. He thought about Nara sitting in the early mornings by the corral, carrying a guilt that was built on an incomplete picture of the night her father died, a picture with a figure missing from it. He thought about a 14-year-old boy who had tried to sit with a frightened bull alone because he wanted to help his sister and also to prove something, and who had been honest about both when asked. He thought about what Nara had said on the third morning quietly, without looking at him. People do that too, waiting to see if the good thing is real, expecting it to end. "Thank you," Jed said to the old man. Chuho nodded once, already looking back toward the east, toward the land and the light. Jed walked back through town with the weight of what he now knew arranged carefully in his mind, and he did not go to the corral, and he did not go to Roy Halston's office, and he did not go to Nara's house. He went to his room above the livery, and he sat on the cot, and he thought for a very long time about the difference between what a person knows and what a person can prove, and about what it means to tell someone a truth that will change the shape of their grief without being able to give them the certainty that would make it clean. He sat there as the afternoon moved across the room in bars of light through the window, and he thought about Roan, and about how many times in his life he had moved past the moment when staying was the harder and more necessary thing. Then he got up and went to find Nara. She was behind the house at the small garden where she and Pip grew what they needed and sold what was left. She was working the soil around some plants with the focused physical attention of a person who uses work to keep the more complicated parts of the mind occupied. She did not look up when he arrived at the fence, but she knew he was there. "You went to see Chuho," she said. It was not a question. Jed opened the gate and came in and sat on the low stone wall at the edge of the garden. He did not speak immediately, and she did not push him to. She kept working, and he sat there, and the sun was warm on both of them. "Roy Halston was at your father's barn the night of the fire," Jed said. Her hand stopped. He told her what Chuho had told him. He told it slowly and carefully and without embellishment, giving her each piece in order, letting each one settle before adding the next. He told her about the voices and the horse and the timing. He told her about Oren and the report that went nowhere. He told her about what Scout's fear response suggested about the quality and proximity of the shouting that night. He did not tell her that her father's death was Halston's fault because he did not know that, and he was not willing to give her the comfort of a certainty he could not stand behind. What he told her was the truth, which was complicated and incomplete, and still in its complicated incompleteness, meaningfully different from what she had been living with. She sat back on her heels in the garden. She put her hands on her thighs. She looked at nothing specific at the middle distance, at something internal. He waited. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet, and in it was the sound of something that has been held at great tension for a long time beginning very slowly to release. "He was there," she said. "Yes." "And he said nothing, for 8 months." "Yes." Another long silence. "I thought it was my fault," she said. "Just that. Just the plain fact of it, said in the voice of someone setting down something that has been very heavy. "I know," Jed said. "It wasn't entirely not my fault," she said with a precision that he recognized as her particular form of honesty, the refusal to trade one oversimplification for another. "If I had not argued with him, he might not have been in the yard when the fire started. He might not have been the one who ran in." "Or he would have been in the barn already," Jed said. "Or he would have run in anyway because that was who he was." She looked at him. "You told me he always thought of Scout before himself," Jed said. "You told me that the first morning." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at her hands in the earth, and something moved through her face that was not resolution, because these things do not resolve cleanly or quickly, but was the beginning of the long gradual process of arriving at something that could in time be called peace. "What do we do," she said, "with what Chuho told you?" Jed thought about this. "I don't think it proves what we might want it to prove," he said honestly. "Halston being there doesn't make him responsible for the lamp being overturned or the barn catching fire. An argument in a barn is not murder, but it changes the picture of the debt. A man who was there when your father died and chose not to come forward and then used that death to advance a claim against your family's land, a claim based on a contract that violates territorial law, that is something a circuit magistrate might find relevant." Nara was quiet, thinking. "The lending rate violation is the strongest ground," Jed said. "That's clean documentable and provable without any argument about what happened the night of the fire. The other part, what Chuho saw, what Scout's fear tells us, that's context. It speaks to the kind of man Halston is, but it's not what wins or loses on paper." "Then we start with what can be proven," Nara said. "Yes." She looked at the garden around her, at the house behind it, at the land that stretched toward the east valley where the water ran and the grass grew and her father had spent his life. "How long do we have?" she asked. 6 weeks until the deadline he's given you," Jed said. "Getting a response from Santa Fe could take 3 weeks if the letter reaches the right person quickly. Could take longer." He paused. "Pip mentioned something the other day about writing to the governor's office directly." Nara looked at him sharply. "Pip is 14. Pip," Jed said, "is 14 years old and pays close attention to everything and has more practical intelligence than most men I've known at twice his age." He paused. "I'm not saying send a child to fight your legal battle. I'm saying the idea came from somewhere real." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, brushing soil from her hands, and looked at the house. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee. We can talk about what the letter needs to say." It was the first time she had invited him into the house. Jed stood from the stone wall and followed her to the door, and as he stepped inside out of the bright afternoon sun, he felt with a quiet and somewhat startling clarity that this was what it felt like to stop moving toward something and arrive. He did not say this. He sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee she set in front of him, and they began to talk about the practical, careful, specific language of a formal complaint, and outside through the window the light lay long and golden across the land that was hers, that her father had worked, that Scout had been named for because he always found his way home. And across town in an office with the lamp burning late, Roy Halston sat with a paper in his hands and thought about the questions a stranger had been asking, and about a bull that was no longer wild, and about whether the thing he had built so carefully over 8 months of patient legal pressure was as secure as he had believed it to be. He was not a foolish man. He knew in the way of people who have been dishonest for a long time that the ground under dishonesty is never as solid as it appears from above. He set the paper down. He looked at the lamp, and he thought about a night 8 months ago and a lamp that had gone over in a struggle that he had not started and had not stopped, and a man who had run into the fire, and a decision he had made in the smoke and the shouting to walk away and say nothing and let the situation become what it became. He had told himself many things about that night in the months since. He had arranged the facts in orders that were more comfortable than the true order. He had built a story in which his absence of action was not a choice, but a simple failure of nerve, in a confusing moment, a thing anyone might have done, a thing that did not make him responsible for the outcome. He had told himself this so many times that most of him believed it. The lamp burned. Outside the town was quiet in the late evening. Down at the end of the street, at the corral beside the livery, a black bull stood peacefully in the dark, breathing slowly, waiting for morning. The storm came on a Wednesday. Not the legal storm, not the one building in letters and documents and the careful, patient architecture of formal complaint that Jed and Nara had been constructing at the kitchen table over the past 2 weeks. The actual storm, the meteorological one, the kind that the desert produces without warning or apology. A wall of dark air rolling in from the southwest, carrying lightning in its belly and the smell of rain on hot rock, which is one of the most particular smells in the world, ancient and clean, and somehow both a warning and a promise simultaneously. Jed smelled it before he saw it. He was at the corral in the late afternoon, inside the fence now as a matter of routine, Scout standing close enough to touch, close enough that the bull's warmth was a presence in the air beside him, the way another person's warmth is a presence when you have grown accustomed to them being near. He smelled the change in the air and looked southwest and saw the darkness massed above the canyon walls and knew they had perhaps an hour before it arrived. Scout smelled it at the same moment. Jed felt the change in the animal before he saw it, the subtle shifting of weight, the ears moving from their easy forward position to something more alert, the first suggestion of tension returning to muscles that had spent 2 weeks learning how to be loose. Jed put his hand on Scout's neck and kept it there. "Easy," he said quietly. Not a word for the bull so much as a sound, a quality of voice that said the person making it was not afraid, which in the language that mattered here communicated more than any word could. Scout breathed. Nara arrived at the fence at a near run, which was the first time Jed had seen her move with urgency rather than purpose, and the distinction told him something about how frightened she was for the bull. "I saw the sky," she said, gripping the top rail. "He's going to panic." "Maybe," Jed said. "We don't know that yet. The last storm 3 months ago he hurt himself on the fence." Her voice was controlled, but only just. "He ran at it until the posts bled him." "That was before," Jed said. He said it calmly, not dismissively, and met her eyes through the fence rails. "That was before any of this." She looked at Scout, who was trembling slightly now, a fine tremor visible along his flanks. Not yet panic, not yet the explosive, consuming fear that had driven him into fences and sent men running. But the edge of it, the approach of it, the way a fire smells before you see the smoke. Pip appeared at Nara's shoulder, arrived without announcement, as he often did, seeming to materialize where he was needed by some sense that was particular to younger siblings everywhere. He took in the scene quickly and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Jed spoke to Scout without raising his voice. He did not use the bull's name repeatedly or reach for him in any urgent way. He simply kept his hand on the animal's neck and his voice in the air between them, a low and continuous presence, like a current in water that you feel rather than see. He talked about nothing in particular. He talked about the canyon road that had brought him to Dustfall, about the particular quality of light on the red rock in the late afternoon, when the angle is low and everything looks like it is lit from within. He talked about a river he had crossed in Montana 4 years ago that had been so clear you could see the individual stones on the bottom 20 feet down and count them. He talked about his mother's kitchen in West Texas, the smell of bread, the way the morning light came in through the single east window and lay across the floor in a rectangle that moved as the hours moved. He talked the way you talk to someone you trust with the unimportant things, which is the most intimate kind of talking there is, because the unimportant things are the ones you only share when you are not afraid of being judged for them. Scout's trembling did not stop, but it did not accelerate. The first lightning came still distant, a flash above the canyon walls that lit the underside of the cloud silver. 3 seconds later the thunder reached them, a low, rolling sound that moved through the ground as well as the air. Scout flinched. His whole body moved with it, a single violent shudder, and his hooves shifted, and for one long moment the balance could have gone either way. Jed felt it in his hand on the bull's neck, the moment of decision that happens in an animal's body before the animal itself has made any conscious choice, the tipping point between flight and stillness. He did not tighten his grip. He kept his hand exactly as it was, present and undemanding, and he kept talking in the same unhurried voice about the river in Montana, and the stones on the bottom, and the specific quality of cold that glacial water has when you stand in it up to your knees. Scout shuddered again. And then, with the particular quality of a decision made, rather than a panic survived, he lowered his head. Not in submission, in something closer to resignation, or perhaps acceptance, the recognition that the frightening thing was here and was not going to kill him, and he was still standing, and the hand on his neck was still there. He lowered his head and breathed heavily through his nose, and did not run. At the fence, Nara had both hands on the top rail and was watching with the concentrated stillness of someone who is afraid to move in case movement disturbs something fragile. The rain came. First, a few drops, large and deliberate, the way the desert's rain always begins, as though each drop is a test to see if the earth is ready. Then more. Then all of it at once, the way storms in the territory do not escalate, but simply arrive, the full force of them present without transition, warm and heavy and smelling of every dry week that had preceded it. Jed was soaked in seconds. He did not move from where he stood. Scout pressed against him slightly, not in fear, but in the way of a large animal seeking contact with something solid when the world becomes loud and wet and uncertain. Jed let himself be leaned on. He put both hands on the bull's neck and stood in the rain and talked about the river in Montana and the stones. Lightning struck close this time. The crack of it was immediate and enormous, the kind of sound that bypasses thought entirely and goes straight to the body's oldest responses. Scout lunged sideways, a powerful involuntary movement, and Jed went with it rather than against it, moving as the bull moved, keeping contact without resistance, and said Scout's name once clearly in the same voice he had used every morning for 3 weeks. Scout stopped. He was breathing in long, ragged pulls, his sides heaving, the rain running in rivulets off his black coat. But he was still. He turned his head and looked at Jed with those dark eyes that held the accumulated knowledge of 8 months of fear, and Jed looked back at him, soaked and standing in the mud of the corral floor, and said again, easy, and meant it in every possible sense of the word. At the fence, Nara made a sound that was too quiet to hear over the rain, but Jed saw it on her face when he looked up, the way it moved through her expression and left something different behind it, something that was not quite joy because it was too raw and too close to loss to be called by the name of a lighter feeling, but was related to joy, the way spring is related to the hardest part of winter. Pip had his fists pressed against his mouth and was watching Scout with bright eyes. The storm moved over them and through them, and the lightning moved east, and the thunder followed it, growing quieter by degrees, and the rain softened from its full intensity to something steadier and more gentle, and Scout stood in it with his head against Jed's shoulder and breathed. Later, much later, when the rain had reduced itself to a patient drizzle, and the sky had cleared in the west enough to show a strip of orange above the canyon walls, Jed came out of the corral and stood at the fence where Nara was still standing. He was completely wet. She was completely wet. Neither of them commented on this because it was obvious and because the rain was beside the point. She looked at him with that expression he had come to recognize, the one that was not gratitude, because she was not a person who wore gratitude on the surface, but was what gratitude looks like when it is too large to be expressed directly and comes out instead as simple, unguarded recognition. They stood in the drizzle for a while without speaking. Then she said quietly and without looking at him, "I knew it in my head. What you told me about Halston, about what Chuho saw. I have known it for 2 weeks." Jed waited. "Knowing a thing in your head and being free of it are not the same," she said. "I have been finding that out." She looked at Scout standing quietly in the wet dark, his sides still moving with the slow recovery of an animal that has come through something and found itself still standing. Tonight, watching him choose to stay, watching him decide that the storm was not the same as the fire, she paused. "I think I understood something I had only known before." Jed looked at her. "What did you understand?" She was quiet for a long moment. The drizzle moved through the lamplight from the livery in fine silver threads. "That carrying the whole weight of something does not mean you cause the whole of it," she said finally. "I said things to my father that I cannot unsay. That part is mine and I am not putting it down, but I had made it mean more than it meant. I had let it be the only story." She paused. "Scout did not cause the fire either. He was just inside it, and he has been paying for it for 8 months. She looked at Jed directly then, in the full, open way she rarely allowed herself. "I think I have been doing the same thing," she said. Jed did not say that she was wrong to have carried it because she was not entirely wrong, and she would have known the difference. He did not say it was over now because it was not over, and she would have known that too. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Scout put his head on my shoulder tonight, in the middle of the lightning. He didn't run." "I saw," she said. "He's been inside that storm for 8 months," Jed said quietly. "Tonight he just stood in it instead. That's not nothing." Nara looked at Scout one more time, then she turned toward the house. "Come inside," she said. "Pip made soup. It won't be good, but it will be hot." She looked at the corral where Scout was standing quietly in the drizzle, calm in the aftermath of the storm. "My father used to say that Scout could always find his way home," she said, "no matter how far he went." "I know," Jed said. "You told me the first morning." She looked at him. The orange light from the western strip of sky was on her face. "I think my father was right," she said. "I think Scout has been trying to find his way back for 8 months." "He found it," Jed said. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at Jed with a directness that was characteristic of her, no soft approach, no circling, just the thing itself stated plainly. "And you," she said, "have you?" The question sat between them in the drizzling air with the smell of rain on desert rock and the sound of Scout breathing quietly in the corral. Jed looked at her for a long moment. "I think so," he said. "I think I'm finding it." She held his gaze. Then she turned toward the house. "Come inside," she said. "Pip made soup. It won't be good, but it will be hot." Jed followed her to the house in the rain, and for the first time in 11 years, the feeling of following someone toward a door rather than away from one did not produce in him the familiar instinct to calculate the distance to the road. The letter from Santa Fe arrived on a Friday morning 3 days before Roy Halston's deadline. Pip had sent it. Not the official complaint that Jed had helped draft, which had gone to the Territorial Lending Authority through proper channels and which they were still waiting to hear from. Something else. Something the boy had written on his own 2 weeks prior in the evenings after dinner, working at the kitchen table with his tongue pressed against his lip, the way he did when he was concentrating drafting and redrafting in the careful, deliberate hand of someone who knows that the words have to be exactly right. He had not told Nara. He had not told Jed. He had addressed it to the office of the territorial governor, marked it urgent and legal matter, walked it to the post himself before dawn on a Tuesday, and told no one, because he understood at 14, with the particular intelligence that was his specific form, that telling people what you intend to do before you do it gives them the opportunity to talk you out of it. The response came on a Friday with the Morning Post, a formal letter bearing the seal of the New Mexico Territory, addressed to Miss Nara Longbow of Dustfall, and opening with the words, "The Territorial Office of Civil Oversight has received your written complaint regarding the matter of Halston Land and Loan and the associated lending practices, and wishes to inform you that a territorial inspector has been dispatched." Nara read it standing at the kitchen table. She read it a second time. Then she set it down and looked at Pip, who was sitting across the table with the expression of someone who is trying to appear as though they do not know what the letter says. "You wrote to the governor's office," she said. "To the Civil Oversight Office," Pip said precisely. "The governor's office directed it there." "When?" "2 weeks ago." "You didn't tell me." "No." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze with that steady quality of his, the particular composure of a person who has done what they believed was right and is prepared to live with the consequences of it, regardless of whether those consequences are pleasant. "I was going to say something," Pip said. "When I heard back, I didn't want to give you hope that didn't arrive." Nara looked at the letter again. Then she looked at her brother, this boy who was 14 years old and had walked a letter to the post before dawn without telling anyone because he thought it was the right thing to do, and because he understood that sometimes the people you love most need to be protected from the weight of their own caution. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him in the brief, fierce way of people who are not naturally demonstrative but mean it absolutely when they are. Pip allowed this for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Nara," in the tone of someone who has a dignity to maintain, and she released him and stepped back, and her eyes were bright. Jed arrived at the house an hour later, and Nara showed him the letter, and he read it with the careful attention of someone who knows how official language works and is reading for what it actually says beneath the formal phrasing. "A territorial inspector," he said. "That's above Oren's jurisdiction entirely." "Yes," Nara said. "When does he arrive?" "The letter says within 5 days of the date of writing." She paused. "The letter is dated Monday." Jed looked at the date. "Then he could be here today, or tomorrow, or the day after Roy Halston's deadline." "The deadline," Jed said carefully, "becomes less relevant when there's an active territorial inspection of the contract that underpins it." He paused. "I'd like to go and see Halston, today." Nara looked at him sharply. "Why?" "Because there's something I want to say to him before this goes further," Jed said. "Not a threat, not a negotiation, something else." She studied him. She had learned to trust the quality of his deliberateness, the fact that he did not move toward things impulsively, but moved toward them with intention, and that when he said something else, he meant something specific that he had already thought through. "All right," she said. Jed went to Roy Halston's office in the middle of the morning when the street was warm and the town was conducting its ordinary business around the ordinary fact that in a few days something would be resolved one way or another that had been building for 8 months. He knocked. Halston's voice from inside said, "Come in," with the particular flatness of a man who has been expecting something unpleasant and has decided to receive it without showing that he was expecting it. The office was a functional room, a desk with papers on it arranged in the neat stacks of someone who uses order as a form of control, a bookshelf with ledgers, a window that faced the main street and gave a view of everything that moved in it. Halston was behind the desk. He was a large man who had once been larger, with the careful stillness of someone who has learned to take up space without moving through it unnecessarily. His face was heavy and composed, the face of a man who has negotiated a great deal and has learned to keep his responses interior. He looked at Jed without surprise. "Mr. Calloway," he said. Jed sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited, to which was a choice that communicated something without being aggressive about it. He put his hat on his knee and looked at Halston directly. "A territorial inspector is coming," Jed said. You probably have people who tell you things you may already know. Halston's expression did not change. I may. The lending rate in the longbow contract violates territorial law by 40%, Jed said. That's documentable and provable, and the inspector will see it within an hour of reviewing the paperwork. He paused. The amount the Longbow family actually owes under a legal rate is substantially less than what they have. They can pay it today. Halston looked at him steadily. There are other provisions in the contract. Provisions in a contract that violates territorial law are not enforceable, Jed said. You know that. You've known the rate was illegal since you wrote the contract. A silence sat between them that had real weight to it. Why are you here? Halston said finally. If the inspector is coming and the law is clear, why come to me? Jed looked at him. He had thought about this carefully in the way he thought about things that mattered, turning it over from multiple directions before arriving at what he actually wanted to say. Because I've been in Dustfall for a month, he said, and in that time I've learned something about what happens when people make decisions in fear or anger and then build their lives around justifying those decisions. He paused. You lost something real in 1871, 12 years of work. That was a genuine loss, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. Halston said nothing, but something shifted very slightly in his expression, something that had not been there a moment before. But you turned that loss into a method, Jed said, and then you carried that method into the night of a fire, and you walked away from a man who needed help, and you have been collecting a debt ever since that you have no legal right to collect. He paused. I'm not saying this to threaten you. The inspector is coming, and the law will do what the law does regardless of what I say to you. I'm saying it because I think you know all of this already, and you have been knowing it, and I think that kind of knowing when you won't look at it has a cost. Halston looked at the desk, at his hands on the desk, at the papers arranged in their careful stacks. You sound very certain about what people know, he said, and his voice was different now, something below its surface that had not been there before. No, Jed said. I'm certain about what I know from my own experience, which is that carrying something you won't look at costs more than putting it down. The silence lasted a long time. Then Roy Halston opened the center drawer of his desk and removed a single sheet of paper that he had clearly written before Jed arrived, which meant he had anticipated this moment or something like it and had prepared for it in the only way he had left. He set it on the desk and pushed it across toward Jed. It was a debt cancellation notice, formal signed, dated that morning. Jed looked at it and then looked at Halston. There is also, Halston said, and his voice had the quality of something being put down after being carried a long way, a matter of what I witnessed on the night of Thomas Longbow's death. I have written a statement for the inspector. It is not a confession of wrongdoing because I committed no deliberate act, but it is a truthful account of what occurred. He paused. The lamp was overturned in the argument. I could not have prevented the fire, but I could have helped, and I did not, and I told no one I was there. That is a thing I should have addressed before now. Jed looked at him for a long moment. He had come into this office expecting to find a man who had constructed his dishonesty so carefully that it had become invisible to him, the way people do when they have lived with a story long enough. Instead, he found a man who had been living with a different story than the one he had shown the world, and who had apparently spent the past weeks since Jed's first questions and the news of the inspector sitting with the accumulated weight of it. The statement will matter to Nara Longbow, Jed said carefully, not because it changes what happened, but because she has been carrying a version of that night that was missing important facts. I know, Halston said. His voice was quiet and without its usual composition, just a man's voice saying a thing he meant. I know she has. Jed took the debt cancellation notice from the desk. He stood and picked up his hat. He looked at Roy Halston one more time, this large, careful, damaged man who had let his own loss curdle into something that had cost other people more than it had cost him, and who was only now late and imperfectly beginning to put it down. Thank you, Jed said. Just that. He left the office and walked back up the main street in the warm morning light with the paper in his hand and the complex, unresolvable weight of understanding that most of the harm people do to each other comes not from malice, but from wounds they have never properly tended, which does not make the harm less real, but makes the world more complicated than the simple story of good people and bad people would have it be. He went to find Nara. She was at the corral as she often was in the mornings now, not anxiously watching for danger, but simply there in the way of someone who comes to a place because the place itself has become part of what grounds them. Scout was beside her at the fence, his great head over the top rail, his eyes half closed in the morning warmth. Jed stopped beside her and handed her the paper. She read it. She read it twice. Then she looked up. "He did this himself," she said. "Yes." "Why?" Jed considered the question. "Because he's been carrying something heavy for a long time," he said. "And I think he's tired." Nara looked at the paper. Then she looked at Scout, who opened his eyes and regarded her with the calm attention that had replaced the wild terror of 3 weeks ago, the gaze of an animal that has found at last the evidence it needed to believe that the world contains things other than danger. "There's something else," Jed said. He told her about the written statement, not the facts of the night which she already carried, but the fact of the document itself. That Halston had written it before Jed arrived, that he had chosen to put his name to the truth without being forced to. When Jed finished, Nara was quiet for a long time. Scout shifted beside her and pressed his nose against her shoulder, and she reached up without looking and put her hand against his jaw. "He wrote it himself," she said. Not a question. A thing being turned over and examined from all sides. "Before I got there," Jed said, "he had it ready." She looked at the debt cancellation notice in her hand, then at the corral, then at the East Valley beyond it. "I have known for 2 weeks that he was there," she said carefully. "I have known the fire was an accident. I have known my argument with my father was not what killed him." She paused. "I knew all of it here." She touched 2 fingers briefly to her temple. "But knowing and being free of something are not the same thing. I think I am only beginning to learn the distance between them." Scout pressed closer to her side. "My father," she said quietly, "would not have wanted Halston destroyed. He was not a man who wanted that for anyone." She looked at the statement in Jed's hand. "But he would have wanted the truth written down somewhere, to exist in a place that could not be taken back." "It exists now," Jed said. She nodded once. Then she straightened and looked at the East Valley with an expression that was not forgiveness, because that would take considerably longer, and she was honest enough not to call it by that name yet, but was the first necessary condition for forgiveness to eventually become possible. She looked at the East Valley, at the land that was hers, that the paper in her hand said was still and would remain hers. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and this moment was too large for the ordinary expression of it, the way very large things are sometimes too heavy for the container of tears. She stood very still and breathed and let it move through her, which is sometimes the only thing to do with the things that are too large to be expressed in any ordinary way. Scout pressed closer to her side. After a long time she said, "I want to show him the East Valley." Jed looked at her. "Scout," she said, "I want to take him out there, to the land. My father used to walk him there in the evenings. Before everything." She paused. "I think he's ready." Jed looked at the bull. Scout looked back at him with those dark eyes that had held so much fear for so long, and were now holding something different, something that had no perfect name, but that lived in the neighborhood of peace. "I think you're right," Jed said. The territorial inspector arrived that afternoon, a compact and efficient man named Vasquez, who had the particular quality of someone who has reviewed many contracts in many small towns and has learned to be neither surprised nor moved by the ingenuity with which people find ways to exploit one another. He reviewed the Longbow contract and Halston's written statement and Jed's formal complaint in one sitting, and by evening he had issued a preliminary finding that the contract was void, as written that the debt as legally calculated had been discharged by Halston's own instrument, and that Halston's conduct regarding the night of Thomas Longbow's death would be forwarded to the appropriate office for review. He was in Dustfall for one night. He was gone by the following morning. In his wake, things settled into the shape they would hold, which was the shape of things after large forces have moved through and the land has returned to itself, changed but standing. Magistrate Oren, upon receiving the inspector's preliminary finding, became suddenly and comprehensively cooperative, a transformation that Pip observed with the dry attention of someone adding a data point to a long-running hypothesis about the relationship between accountability and behavior. Roy Halston left Dustfall 2 weeks later. He did not leave in shame or in a hurry. He left the way people leave places they have been in too long for the wrong reasons, with a kind of quiet recognition that the chapter is finished. He sold the loan office to a woman from Albuquerque who charged legal rates and kept accurate records and ran the business without the weight of old grievance underneath it. Where he went, Jed did not know and did not ask. On the morning of the third Saturday after the inspector's visit, Nara opened the corral gate for the first time in 8 months. Scout stood at the opening for a long moment. He looked at the gate. He looked at Nara, who stood to the side of it with her hand open at her side, not gesturing, not urging, just present and still. He walked through. He walked slowly with the careful deliberateness of an animal testing new ground out of the corral and into the open space beyond it. And he stopped and raised his head and breathed the air that was not enclosed by fences, and his nostrils moved with the information in it, the grass and the dust, and the specific combination of scents that is a territory recognized. Jed stood 20 feet away. He watched. Scout walked toward the east, toward the valley, toward the land his owner's father had walked him across in the evenings before everything changed. He walked with increasing sureness, each step more committed than the last, and when he reached the edge of the open pasture land, he stopped and looked back, a long look in the direction of the town and the people standing at the edge of it, and then he turned and walked on. Nara stood beside Jed. Her hand, without either of them making a particular decision about it, found his and held it. They watched Scout cross the field in the morning light. The bull moved with a quality that Jed recognized from horses that had come back from bad places, a careful reclaiming of their own movement, a gradual return to the way they had been before the world frightened them. He did not run. He walked with that deliberate sureness, and the grass moved around his legs in the warm air, and the canyon walls caught the light and held it the color of copper and old rust. "He's finding his way back," Pip said from behind them. His voice had a softness in it that he would have been embarrassed about if he had known Jed heard it, and so Jed said nothing and kept watching Scout move across the field. "He always does," Nara said. They stood together in the morning, the three of them, and watched the bull cross the land at his own pace, unhurried, certain. And behind them, the town went about its ordinary business in the warm light of an ordinary day that was also in the way of ordinary days that turn out to contain things you carry the rest of your life, something more than ordinary. Later that afternoon, when Scout had made his way back to the edge of the pasture and was grazing with the settled composure of an animal that has returned to itself, Nara and Jed sat on the low stone wall at the edge of her garden. The soup Pip made for dinner was already on the stove, and its smell came through the open kitchen window, and the light was that late western light that does not so much fade as deepen. Turning everything, it touches the color of things that have been kept for a long time and are better for it. "You stayed," Nara said. It was not quite a question. "I stayed," Jed said. "Your horse is healed. Abel has been healed for 3 weeks." "I know," Jed said. She looked at him. "Why?" He turned to look at her, and in the answer he gave he did not look away or qualify it with the distances and contingencies that had been his habit for 11 years. "Because I found what I was looking for," he said. "I didn't know I was looking for it, but I found it." She held his gaze. Then she looked at the pasture where Scout grazed in the long light. "My father's land needs work," she said. "The east boundary fence needs rebuilding. The north field hasn't been properly tended in a year. Pip is good with tools, but he's 14. "I'm good with tools," Jed said. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you fix the corral fence for 3 weeks. A pause. "I wasn't going to ask." "I know you weren't," he said. "You don't ask for things." "No," she agreed. "I don't." "Then I'll just stay," he said. "And we won't call it anything in particular until it's clear what it is." She was quiet for a moment. Then the small sound that was the cousin of a laugh warmer than the first time he had heard it more of itself. "That is a very patient way of doing things," she said. "It's the only way I know," Jed said, "that actually works." Scout raised his head in the pasture and looked back at the house. He stood there for a moment in the evening light, large and dark and calm, and then he lowered his head and went back to grazing. Pip came to the kitchen window and said dinner was ready, using a tone that communicated dinner had been ready for several minutes, and he had been exercising considerable restraint in not mentioning it sooner. Nara stood and Jed stood, and they walked to the house together in the golden light of a summer evening in New Mexico in 1886, and Jed Calloway, who had been moving towards something or away from something for 11 years, without ever being entirely certain which, stepped through the door of a house where people were waiting and the food was on the table, and outside a black bull grazed peacefully on land that was his to graze on, and understood with the quiet completeness of a thing that has been true for a while before you find the word for it, that he had come home. Not to a place he had been before, to a place he was going to be. There is a kind of stillness that is not emptiness. It is the stillness of water that has found its level, of a fire that has burned down to coals, of a man who has stopped running and looked up and found that where he stopped is exactly where he needed to be. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with ceremony. It is simply there in the smell of soup and the sound of a boy talking too fast about something that happened at the general store, and the particular quality of light through a west-facing window at the end of a long, good day. Jed sat down at the table. Pip put a bowl in front of him and said with the assessing precision that was his characteristic gift, "It's better than last time." "It smells good," Jed said. "I added something," Pip said, not specifying what, with the confidence of someone who has decided the results speak for themselves. Nara sat across from Jed and looked at him across the table and did not say anything, but in her expression was the plain and uncomplicated fact of a woman who has survived a hard thing and come out the other side of it into something she had not expected to find, something that felt cautiously and with full awareness of how cautiously it needed to be approached, like the beginning of being all right. Outside, the light went slowly off the canyon walls. Scout grazed in the pasture. The stars came out one by one above the desert, the way they do, the way they always have, the way they will long after everyone at that table is part of the land they loved. The soup was in fact better than last time. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.